For years, the world believed it knew Whitney Houston. The flawless smile, the effortless high notes, the image of perfection carefully polished by executives, headlines, and expectations that left no room for cracks. To the public, she was the voice. To the industry, she was the product. But behind the applause and the blinding lights, Whitney carried a truth that didn't fit the image they built for her. This story begins on the day Whitney Houston did something no one expected. She walked away. Not from music, not from her gift, but from the version of herself the world demanded she be. What followed wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no press conference, no final performance, no goodbye speech. Instead, there was silence, distance, and a quiet decision that would redefine her life in ways few ever noticed until much later. This is not the story you've heard before. This is about identity, pressure, and the cost of being worshipped but not truly seen. Stay with this story until the end, because what Whitney chose to leave behind, and what she chose to protect, reveals a side of her that fame could never capture. Whitney Houston learned early that success came with conditions. Long before stadiums echoed her name, before magazine covers crowned her America's sweetheart, she felt the invisible boundaries closing in. Every smile had a purpose. Every note had an expectation attached to it. The world didn't just love her voice. It needed her to represent something flawless, controlled, and endlessly marketable. By the late 1980s, Whitney's image had become almost sacred. Executives spoke about her in numbers and demographics. Interviewers asked questions that circled the same themes: grace, discipline, perfection. There was no room for messiness, no tolerance for doubt. Even vulnerability had to be rehearsed. At first, Whitney played along. She believed that discipline was the price of greatness. She told herself that every artist made sacrifices. But as the years passed, the line between who she was and who she was expected to be began to blur, then disappear. Behind closed doors, the pressure followed her home. Friends noticed how often she stared into mirrors, not admiring herself, but searching. She wasn't looking for beauty. She was looking for permission to be human. The person staring back wore the same face the world adored, yet felt increasingly unfamiliar. The industry rewarded obedience. Every time Whitney complied, changed a look, softened an opinion, avoided a topic, she was praised as professional. But each compromise carved away a piece of her autonomy. Slowly, the image became a cage disguised as a crown. What few understood was that Whitney wasn't rebelling. She wasn't trying to sabotage anything. She was simply exhausted. Tired of being told what her voice should represent. Tired of smiling through interviews that felt more like performances than conversations. Tired of carrying an image that didn't allow her to rest. The breaking point didn't arrive in a boardroom or on a stage. It came quietly late one night, after a long day of rehearsals and meetings. Whitney sat alone, the house silent except for the hum of distant city noise. No makeup, no cameras, no applause, just her thoughts. She realized something that terrified her. The image the world loved would survive without her, but she might not survive it. That thought stayed with her. It echoed during performances. It lingered in moments of applause that once energized her, but now felt hollow. The crowd cheered for the idea of Whitney Houston, not the woman standing beneath the lights. The expectations were relentless. Be strong but not angry. Be confident but never confrontational. Be authentic but only within approved limits. The contradiction weighed on her. How could she be herself if the self the world accepted was carefully scripted? Whitney began pulling back in subtle ways. Fewer interviews. Shorter appearances. She stopped explaining herself, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of survival. Each step away felt dangerous, like stepping off a familiar path into darkness, yet also strangely freeing. Those closest to her sensed the shift. Conversations deepened. Laughter returned in private moments. There were glimpses of the woman she had been before the image took over. Playful, reflective, stubbornly honest. But the public saw only absence and speculation. They called it decline. They called it controversy. They called it confusion. They didn't see what was really happening. Whitney wasn't falling apart. She was pulling herself back together. Walking away from the image didn't mean rejecting her gift. It meant refusing to let that gift erase her humanity. For the first time in years, she wasn't asking how to meet expectations. She was asking what she needed to survive. And that question, once asked, could never be unanswered. The distance Whitney created was immediately noticed and immediately misunderstood. In an industry trained to interpret every move as strategy, silence was treated as scandal. Executives whispered about lost momentum. Headlines speculated about her state of mind. Fans debated whether she still cared. No one considered that stepping back might be the most intentional choice she had made in years. Whitney felt the shift the moment she stopped explaining herself. Invitations slowed. Conversations changed tone. The same people who once praised her discipline now questioned her reliability. It confirmed what she had quietly suspected. The image had always mattered more than the woman. In private, the silence felt unfamiliar but necessary. Without constant demands, her days stretched open. She slept longer. She listened to music without analyzing it. Sometimes she sang alone, softly, without warming up or performing, just to feel sound move through her chest again. Those moments reminded her why she had fallen in love with singing in the first place. Not for applause, but for release. Yet silence also brought confrontation. Without distractions, unresolved feelings surfaced. Regret, anger, grief for versions of herself she had never been allowed to become. Whitney realized how often she had been praised for endurance instead of honesty. Strength, she learned, had been defined as silence. She thought back to interviews where she'd laughed off invasive questions, to rehearsals where exhaustion was dismissed as weakness, to meetings where decisions about her life were discussed as if she weren't in the room. None of it had seemed outrageous at the time. It had been normal, expected. Now, distance gave her clarity. She began noticing how often women in the industry were asked to shrink themselves for comfort. How emotion was tolerated only when it was palatable. How vulnerability became a liability once it stopped selling. Whitney had lived inside those rules for so long that breaking them felt almost disorienting. The applause, once intoxicating, replayed differently in her memory. She remembered moments on stage when the crowd roared, yet she felt oddly detached, like she was watching herself from above. At the time, she'd blamed exhaustion. Now she understood it was disconnection. The sound had been loud, but it hadn't been listening. Friends encouraged her to make a comeback. The word bothered her. Come back to what? To the expectations? To the silence disguised as success? She didn't want to return. She wanted a reset. Whitney didn't announce any of this. There were no statements, no dramatic gestures. Her resistance was quiet. She declined projects that felt wrong. She asked questions she'd never dared to ask before. She insisted on pauses. Rest. Boundaries. Each small act felt radical. Of course, resistance had consequences. Contracts dissolved. Support wavered. The safety net she'd assumed was permanent began to fray. But alongside fear came something else, relief. For the first time, decisions felt like they belonged to her. Late one afternoon, she sat near a window, watching light fade across the room. She thought about the younger version of herself, ambitious, hopeful, unaware of the cost of perfection. She wished she could tell her that success didn't have to mean disappearance, that a voice could be powerful without being polished into submission. The world interpreted Whitney's silence as absence. In truth, it was presence, deeper and more grounded than anything she had known before. She wasn't hiding. She was listening. To herself. To her body. To truths that had been drowned out by noise. And somewhere beneath the speculation and rumors, a quiet transformation was taking place. Whitney Houston was learning that stepping away from the image didn't mean losing her voice. It meant finally hearing it. Walking away from the image didn't instantly bring peace. In fact, it forced Whitney to confront something far more difficult than public judgment, herself, without the filter of expectation. For years, mirrors had reflected a version of her shaped by approval, stylists, managers, cameras deciding which angles were acceptable and which emotions should be hidden. Now, with fewer eyes watching, she began to notice how unfamiliar her own reflection felt. At first, the quiet unsettled her. Without a schedule built around appearances and performances, time expanded in uncomfortable ways. Mornings arrived without urgency. Evenings passed without rehearsals. Whitney realized how rarely she had lived without being on. The image hadn't just been external, it had lived inside her, shaping how she moved, spoke, and even thought. She began small. Simpler clothes. Fewer people around. Days without makeup, without scripts, without having to explain who she was supposed to be. These choices might have seemed insignificant to outsiders, but to Whitney they felt revolutionary. Each one stripped away a layer of performance. There were moments of doubt. She wondered if she had made a mistake, if distance would erase her instead of freeing her. The industry had always rewarded visibility. Invisibility felt dangerous. But every time she considered stepping back into the role that had once defined her, something inside resisted. The image no longer fit. Whitney started journaling again, not for lyrics, not for future projects, but for honesty. She wrote about exhaustion, about resentment she'd never admitted, about love for music that had been complicated by pressure. She acknowledged how often she'd been told to be grateful instead of truthful. How perfection had been praised even when it hurt. One entry stood out. She wrote that the hardest part wasn't losing approval, it was unlearning the belief that approval equaled worth. That idea had been planted early and reinforced often. Success had come with conditions. Be composed. Be agreeable. Be flawless. And above all, don't disrupt the narrative. Looking back, Whitney could see how often she'd been applauded for silence. For enduring. For smiling through moments that deserved acknowledgement, not applause. The image had demanded emotional discipline, not authenticity. As she reclaimed her days, she also reclaimed her voice in quieter ways. She spoke more honestly with people she trusted. She said no without apologizing. She allowed herself to feel anger without rushing to soften it. These changes didn't make headlines, but they reshaped her inner world. Music returned slowly, gently. She sang without recording, without critique, without imagining an audience. Sometimes she stopped mid-note and laughed, surprised by how natural it felt to sing imperfectly. For the first time in years, her voice belonged to her alone. Whitney realized something profound during this period. The image had promised safety but delivered confinement. Stepping away didn't make life easier. It made it real. And real, she discovered, was far more demanding than perfection. There were still people who tried to pull her back, who reminded her of what she owed the public, who spoke of legacy as if it were a contract. Whitney listened, but she no longer allowed those voices to override her own. The mirror, once an instrument of judgment, became something else entirely. It reflected a woman still learning, still uncertain, but undeniably present. No costume, no role, just herself. By choosing distance, Whitney wasn't rejecting her past. She was redefining it. She was claiming the right to exist beyond the image, to be complex, inconsistent, and human. And in that quiet reclamation, something powerful began to take shape. Not a comeback, not a reinvention for the public, but a return to herself, unpolished, unfinished, and finally free to decide who Whitney Houston would be next. The pushback didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through phone calls that sounded friendly but felt calculated, through messages framed as concern but heavy with expectation. Whitney had known this moment would come. Walking away from the image was one thing. Refusing to return to it was another. At first, the conversations were subtle. Former collaborators spoke about timing and opportunities slipping away. Executives reminded her how quickly the industry moved, how silence could be misinterpreted as weakness or decline. They used words like relevance and momentum, as if her existence depended on constant visibility. Whitney listened calmly, but inside, something tightened. She recognized the pattern. The same voices that once promised protection now hinted at consequences. The image they had built wasn't just branding, it was leverage. She realized then that the distance she'd taken had disrupted more than expectations. It had disrupted control. Meetings were requested, some urgent, some framed as casual catch-ups. Whitney declined most of them. When she did agree to sit down, the tension was immediate. Smiles didn't reach eyes. Compliments were followed by conditions. Praise came with reminders of what she represented. One conversation stayed with her. A longtime industry figure leaned forward and said, almost gently, "People don't fall in love with complexity. They fall in love with consistency." The message was clear. Humanity was risky. Imperfection was inconvenient. Whitney felt anger rise, not loud, not explosive, but steady. For years, she had carried the burden of consistency at the expense of truth. She had absorbed disappointment silently, believing that gratitude required compliance. Now, being asked to return to that role felt like being asked to erase herself. The resistance intensified. Rumors began circulating that she was difficult, unstable, unreliable. Stories filled the vacuum her silence created. Whitney watched from a distance as speculation replaced fact. It hurt more than she expected. Not because she believed the rumors, but because she recognized how quickly narratives were rewritten when someone stopped playing their part. Friends urged her to respond, to correct the record. Whitney hesitated. She understood that defending herself publicly would pull her back into the performance she had stepped away from. Silence, though painful, was still a choice. But silence came with consequences. Offers disappeared. Invitations stopped arriving. Doors that had once opened effortlessly now stayed closed. Whitney had always known fame was conditional, but feeling those conditions withdraw was sobering. The image had protected her in ways she hadn't fully realized, until it was gone. There were nights when doubt returned, when she wondered if freedom was worth the cost, when the quiet felt less like peace and more like isolation. She missed connection, not applause. She missed being understood, not admired. Yet even in those moments, something held her ground. A sense that returning would fracture something essential inside her. That survival, this time, required honesty. Then came the breaking point. A request arrived. Not an invitation, not a suggestion, but an expectation. A public appearance. Carefully framed. Scripted. Designed to reassure the world that Whitney Houston was still exactly who they wanted her to be. The message ended with a warning disguised as advice. If you don't show up, the story won't be kind. Whitney stared at the words longer than she expected. She felt the weight of everything pressing in: reputation, legacy, fear. This wasn't just about an event. It was about surrender. For the first time since stepping away, she felt truly cornered. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Questions circled relentlessly. Could she withstand being misunderstood? Could she accept being rewritten by others? Could she keep choosing herself if it meant losing everything she'd built? As dawn approached, Whitney sat alone, the request still unanswered, knowing that whatever she decided next would change far more than her career. Because this time, saying no wouldn't just disappoint people. It would challenge the entire image they still believed they owned. Whitney finally understood something she had avoided naming before. The image wasn't just expectation. It was an unspoken contract. As long as she fulfilled it, she was protected, elevated, forgiven. The moment she stepped outside its boundaries, that protection vanished. And now the contract was being enforced. She didn't answer the request right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch. Each hour without a response felt like an act of defiance. Her phone buzzed with follow-ups, increasingly urgent, increasingly stripped of pleasantries. The tone shifted from persuasion to pressure. Whitney read between every line. What they wanted wasn't her presence. It was reassurance. Proof that the system still worked. Proof that she could still be shaped. She thought about how many times she had shown up before, when she wasn't ready. How often she had smiled through exhaustion, nodded through discomfort, delivered excellence while quietly unraveling. The world had applauded the results and ignored the cost. That night, she opened her journal and wrote a single sentence. If I return like this, I disappear. The realization settled heavily, but clearly. Saying yes would be easier, safer. But it would confirm that the image mattered more than the woman behind it. Whitney drafted a response and deleted it. Then another. Words felt dangerous. Anything she said could be twisted, reframed, repackaged. Finally, she sent something simple. Polite. Firm. She declined. The reaction was immediate. Within days, headlines shifted. Whispers turned louder. Commentators speculated openly about her decline, her instability, her lost edge. The story became less about absence and more about failure. Whitney recognized the tactic. If they couldn't control her presence, they would control the narrative. It hurt. More than she expected. Not because she believed the accusations, but because she knew how many people would. Fans who had grown up with her voice now consumed versions of her shaped by strangers. The intimacy she'd built with the public over years of music was being replaced by distance and doubt. Still, she didn't respond. Privately, the cost continued to mount. Financial uncertainty crept in. Legal conversations became tense. People she once trusted distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with someone perceived as difficult. Whitney saw clearly now how loyalty in the industry often followed power, not people. And yet something unexpected happened. In the absence of constant performance, Whitney began to feel steadier. The chaos outside didn't penetrate the way it once would have. She noticed her breath more, her body, her instincts. The noise hadn't disappeared, but it no longer dictated her movements. One afternoon, she received a message from someone she hadn't heard from in years. Not an executive, not a journalist, but a former collaborator who thanked her. Not for hits or accolades, but for choosing honesty. The message was brief, but it lingered. It reminded Whitney that her impact had never been limited to charts or appearances. That there were people who had seen her humanity even when the system hadn't rewarded it. Still, the pressure hadn't eased. A final attempt arrived, more aggressive, more explicit. If she didn't re-engage publicly, projects tied to her legacy would move forward without her input. Decisions would be made on her behalf. History, they implied, would not wait. This wasn't about opportunity anymore. It was about erasure. Whitney sat with that reality longer than anything before. She realized they were willing to preserve the image even if it meant losing her entirely. The image didn't require her consent, just her absence. For the first time, she considered stepping forward not to perform, but to speak. Not to sing, but to disrupt the story being told in her silence. The idea terrified her. Because once she broke that silence on her own terms, there would be no returning to safety, no retreat behind perfection. The truth, once spoken, couldn't be edited. As she closed her journal that night, Whitney knew the next choice would define everything that followed. Not whether she would be seen again, but whether she would finally be heard, even if it cost her everything. I didn't sleep the night. I realized the truth couldn't stay locked inside me anymore. Silence had protected me for a while, but it was starting to feel like another version of obedience. I had stepped away from the image, yes, but as long as I let others explain my absence, I was still being shaped by them. For the first time, I asked myself a question that had nothing to do with survival or strategy. What do I owe myself? That question changed everything. I thought about the girl I once was, the one who sang because it felt like breathing, not because it fulfilled a promise. The one who didn't yet understand how praise could become a cage. Somewhere along the way, I had learned to prioritize being acceptable over being honest. I had confused endurance with strength. I knew now that returning on their terms would be a betrayal I wouldn't recover from. So I chose a different kind of risk. I didn't call a press conference. I didn't release a statement crafted by lawyers. Instead, I agreed to one conversation, quiet, controlled, and honest. No performance. No script. Just my voice, without melody. Sitting there, I felt exposed in a way I never had on stage. Singing had always allowed me to hide inside beauty. Speaking required something else entirely. Presence. I didn't explain everything. I didn't confess for sympathy. I simply told the truth as I understood it. that the image had protected me and harmed me, that I was grateful and exhausted. That perfection had never been the goal, survival had been. And that walking away wasn't failure. It was preservation. I said I was still finding my way, that I didn't have clean answers, that I was choosing myself, even if it made people uncomfortable. When it ended, there was no applause, just silence. And for the first time, silence didn't feel like punishment. The reaction was mixed, exactly as I'd expected. Some praised my honesty. Others called it damage control, weakness, decline. The image didn't dissolve overnight. Narratives never do. But something shifted. The story was no longer being told about me without me. What surprised me most wasn't the public response. It was how my body felt afterward. Lighter, steadier, like I had finally stopped holding my breath. I didn't rush back into the world. I didn't chase redemption arcs or reinvention headlines. I allowed myself time to exist without being interpreted. I learned how unfamiliar that felt, and how necessary. Music returned again, slowly on my terms. Not as obligation, but as connection. I sang because I wanted to, not because silence had scared someone else. Some days I sang beautifully. Other days I didn't sing at all. Both felt honest. I understood then that the image would always exist somewhere, frozen in time, untouched by growth or contradiction. But I didn't belong to it anymore. The cost of walking away had been real, loss, misunderstanding, isolation. But the cost of staying would have been greater. It would have required me to disappear while smiling. I chose differently. I chose to be a woman before being a symbol. To be imperfect before being preserved. To be real, even when reality wasn't marketable. And maybe that choice didn't rewrite history the way some people wanted. Maybe it didn't protect my legacy in the clean, polished way the industry prefers. But it protected me. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.